A massive shout out to the John and Tier member Mr. Leroy 1998 and Jen and Tier Leah Rov. Your support means a lot. If you would like your name mentioned in every video, support the channel, as well as receive special perks and soon having early access to new series, consider becoming a member of this channel by hitting that join button. Hi guys, this is the next part of What If Natsu Was the Son of Acnologia? I hope you enjoy. Natsu wasn't even sure when he fell asleep, but he has woken up in the middle of the night quite abruptly. Voices filled with panic and fear assaulted his ears and he jumped to his feet, red eyes quickly adjusting to the lack of the light, only for the doors of the infirmary to burst open and for someone to slam the light switch on. He hissed, blinking at being suddenly blinded before he willed his eyes to adjust again, and he couldn't help but stare at the sight that greeted him. Mira was standing beside him, eyes filled with worry as she watched the other members bring Laxus and his team into the infirmary. The lightning mage was the only one who appeared at all lucid, his tall form leaning heavily against Gray as the ice mage practically dragged the dragon slayer to the closest bed. Half of the guild clamored around the doors, but most stayed outside as Porlyusica walked inside in her long quick strides. She glanced at him, eyes wide for a moment before she looked away, skin white, and she refused to look at him again. Tartaros, Mira explained in a whisper to Natsu's unasked question. One member attacked Yajima's restaurant. From what we gathered, if it hadn't been for Laxus they all would have been dead. A dark look settled on Natsu's face as he watched Porlyusica rush around the room. The frantic pace didn't slow down the whole night and the whole atmosphere grew grimmer and grimmer, and then Porlyusica finally spoke. What was wrong with them? Magical barrier particles. Inhaled in such quantity it was a miracle they were alive. Laxus especially, considering the number of particles he ate just to keep them from swallowing the whole town. It was nearly morning. No member of the guild had moved from their spot just outside the infirmary, and Natsu was still standing near the bed when Laxus moved. The dragon slayer looked sick, pale skin with bluish lips and skin around his eyes dark as if bruised. His eyes cracked open, bloodshot and watery, and something in Natsu's chest squeezed. He was worried. Is my team alive? He finally croaked, and Natsu, being the closest to his bed, answered. Yes, they were not out of the woods yet, but they were alive at the moment. It was Tartaros, the dragon slayer said, voice barely a whisper. Natsu nodded, anger bubbling under his skin again at the thought. The lightning user was looking at him, bloodshot eyes staring at his burned skin, but he didn't say anything. Coming to the right conclusion, no doubt, the dragon slayer stayed silent for a while, and Natsu wondered if he had passed out again. Is the town safe? He finally asked. Natsu paused. He had no idea, and so he stayed quiet. Makarov was the one to answer. Yes, you saved them. There was an odd tone to his voice and Natsu looked up sharply. Was he lying? With narrowed eyes, he realized that, yes he was. He looked back at Laxus, and with a sigh, stayed quiet. The dragon slayer was staring at him again, tired and worn and looking paler by a minute. Tartaros is after the council members, all of them, he said after a moment of silence, and before Natsu could ask anything the mage fell unconscious again. We should give them space, Porlyusica said sharply, eyes still not meeting Natsu's, and the dragon almost sneered at her. The few members that were inside the infirmary looked at each other, obviously not sure what to do, and with a heavy sigh, Makarov squeezed his grandson's hand and walked out. The others followed soon, silent. Natsu suddenly found himself standing alone in the same room as Porlyusica. You died, she finally managed to say, her voice barely a whisper. Natsu stared at her. The old woman was pale, worn out by making sure the poison members did not die. Part of Natsu was taking a sadistic sort of pleasure that her pallor was likely a result of his own presence just as much as her tiredness. I got better, he finally said. The doors of the infirmary were closed, but he could hear that everyone else was still outside. He suddenly remembered that in the morning Makarov had wanted to announce that he was stepping down as a guild master. He hoped the old man would not just announce who he had in mind for his successor without Natsu there. Porlyusica stared at him, eyes pausing on the red skin of his arm and the bright pink new scar on his jaw and neck. You were hurt. Natsu didn't reply, finding it unnecessary to say anything about the obvious, and simply nodded. She seemed to be struggling to find the words before she finally asked, blunt and to the point, do you know that I knew about your death? Yes. Do you hate me? Natsu considered. I am furious. Porlyusica flinched but nodded, expecting as much. I am sorry. For what it's worth, nothing. Natsu shrugged and then turned around, moving to the door of the infirmary. He looked one last time over his shoulder, worried eyes once again stopping on the dragon slayer whose face was twisted in pain. Porlyusica watched him leave, and the clear worry in his eyes let her relax when she hadn't even known how tense she was the whole night purely because of the dragon's presence in his eyes that bore into her back. Natsu was furious at them. A few years ago, he would have likely killed them or at least maimed them. He knew Acnologia would kill them without a second thought if the Dragon King learned of the vision. But any thought of that quickly evaporated out of his head when he stepped outside of infirmary and every eye turned to look at him. He glanced at Makarov, eyes narrowed, and the old man shook his head, his face still grim. So, he hadn't told them. Natsu resisted the urge to look back at the infirmary. "Let's go downstairs," Makarov announced to the crowded hall. "There are a lot of things we need to discuss." He once again looked at Natsu, and several members turned to look at him as well, and despite the situation were obviously curious. As quickly and orderly as fairy tale could, they crowded around the stage in the guild hall, worried and angry whispers circulating the place. Natsu suddenly felt someone squeeze his hand and looked down to see Annie smile, a tight but sincere smile at him. He squeezed her hand back. She knew exactly what was about to happen. He hadn't spent much time with her lately, he realized. A memory of her braiding his hair when it had been longer and she was younger popped out in his mind's eye, and he shook his head, not sure where did that come from. She was 8 when she and Arthur moved into the same place as him, and Arthur was 10, and while they both were rather reluctant to talk to him, they bonded with Mira and Ultear pretty quickly. "He's terrifying," she had said to her brother a few weeks after they had lived with them. Arthur had shushed her, saying she was rude, but he hadn't had disagreed with her. And Natsu, in a fit of good mood he couldn't remember the source of now, had later that day let the girl braid his hair. It was a horrible mess that he had barely untangled later, but both kids seemed less reluctant to talk to him after that. He blinked, realizing his mind had wandered off, and Makarov was already up on the stage talking. "Crossed every line," he said grimly, "and we will not stand by and let them complete whatever their plans are." A loud chorus of "yes" followed, and the old man took a breath before eyeing them all with an unreadable expression. "I have been a master of this guild longer than I care to admit," the guild quieted at the seemingly random change in subject, "and Tartaros wants war, a war one cannot lead you into, more confusion and even some denial. I am stepping down as the master of fairy tale," the old man said, and raised his hand to quiet down the suddenly loud members. "I will stay here, of course. I have no intention of leaving. I am simply leaving us all in better hands." Natsu didn't miss how he said, "use." He raised an eyebrow as he watched the man talk, wondering why the man couldn't tell him the truth when he obviously trusted him with what was effectively his family. He couldn't help but still see this as some elaborate way to end back in his good graces, or just as likely, to end in good graces of Acnologia. It would be very profitable for anyone to be able to say the dragons were on their side. He felt Annie nudging him in the side in support. Arthur was still staring agape at Makarov, and Ultear and Mira were silent in shock. He shook his head. The old man, despite all his misgivings, was not manipulative and never intentionally sinister. He frowned. "Almost never. Natsu, could you come here?" Makarov's voice once again brought him out of his musing, and the guild turned so silent you could hear a pin drop. For Natsu, that saying was quite literal. Feeling oddly disconnected from himself, he made his way to Makarov, the guild parting in front of him. He held his head high, back straight, and his footsteps sure. A long-forgotten memory of his first visits to the Dragon Island came to his mind, and he almost smiled. He stood in front of the guild, watching their stunned faces, and wondered what he should do now. He paused for a moment, trying to think of the best thing to say, when Arthur suddenly started clapping, and almost immediately everyone followed, their shock seemingly broken. Makarov smiled at him. "I think they agree," he said, referring to Natsu's earlier statement that he will accept only if the guild is okay with it. Natsu couldn't help but smile at that. "It would seem so," he said softly, staring at the mages in front of him in quiet wonder. "Makarov is right," Natsu finally said, without even raising his voice. Everyone fell silent. "This is war. Tartaros started it. We will finish it." A battle cry. That's the only way the resounding cry could be described. Deep underneath the guild, Natsu stood alone with Makarov. The dragon stared at the crystal in the middle of the room, a pale blue glow it was giving, the only light in the room. Maviz's body stood frozen in the crystal. Natsu's skin turned to goosebumps, the whole room singing with something so pure and light it almost hurt. How did he never feel it before? But hadn't he? The fairy tale always seemed to draw out the best in people. Could this be partially the reason behind it? Lumen histoire, Makarov said, eyes looking away from the crystal to look at Natsu with a knowing smile. Natsu realized his mouth was open and he quickly closed them, turning to look at the old master. What is this? Fairy heart. A new voice joined them and Mavis suddenly stood beside them. A sad smile stood on her face as she regarded the two. It is nice to see you again, Natsu. She turned to Makarov, inclining her head. The guild is in good hands. Makarov nodded, eyes still wide, and after a moment, he spoke. You disappeared months ago. Mavis looked back at Natsu, the dragon prince suddenly remembering his funeral. I am dead, Makarov, she said after a moment, her voice soft, but I am always here. I always watch after fairy tale. Natsu's lips turned upwards into a small brief smile. Thank you, he said, and Makarov was certain there was a whole other world behind those words that he couldn't even comprehend. That gratitude had little to do with her watching over fairy tale. Mavis understood and she smiled as well before she turned to her body. Lumen histoire, she began, is fairy tale's light, but also its darkness, its most powerful weapon, and it is the master's job to keep it safe. To keep it from falling into the wrong hands. Natsu looked at the blue crystal, still feeling a bit off balance in its presence. But he couldn't actually feel any magic coming off of it, yet he knew it must be there. Its magic is outside of our possibility to comprehend, Mavis said after a moment as if reading his thoughts, and Natsu turned to her and stared at her for a moment. He stayed silent for a long time. When he spoke, his words shocked Makarov, the essence of a god. Makarov opened his mouth to say something but then fell silent, unsure, and looked at Mavis, who seemed to consider what the dragon prince said. Yes, she said at last, and didn't elaborate but instead asked, did you know it is possible to kill a god? Makarov wanted to object but Natsu nodded. Nothing is truly immortal. A strange smile passed Mavis's lips and she nodded in agreement. The three again found themselves in silence. Mavis finally broke it. Take good care of my guild, seventh master of fairy tale. She turned towards the crystal as if leaving, and Makarov spoke up, will we ever see you again? Mavis smiled a pretty smile at them and shrugged. Who knows, she said, and disappeared. No light or smoke or sound. One moment she was there, the next, she was gone. We need to find out what Tartaros wants with not just current council members but former as well, Natsu found himself saying to the guild. And it will be easier to find council members than Tartaros. Wait, Urza said, frowning, you want to use them as bait? Natsu felt like rolling his eyes. They are already the targets. She still looked unconvinced. So Jalal spoke, look at it this way, we can protect them this way as well. You are not going anywhere, Natsu told the blue-haired mage bluntly, eyebrow raised as if the other mage was being ridiculous. Jalal frowned, eyebrow raised in question before it dawned on him, and he frowned. I am perfectly capable of defending myself, but if you go to another council member, wouldn't that make both of you bigger targets? Arthur asked. Jalal opened his mouth to answer but closed them with a snap when he realized he didn't have a good enough argument to counter that. Natsu stayed silent, his eyes on the paper in front of it where the addresses of all the members they managed to find were written. He looked at the gathered mages again and sighed, here is how we'll do it, suddenly filled the house to their knees in a matter of seconds. We need to get out of here, Annie said, wide-eyed as she moved through the water to the former counselor and his grandson. Arthur nodded, going for the door, and Lucy watched the window, waiting for any sign of the attack. Annie waved a hand in the air, concentrating, and with a muttered name of the spell, Michello and Michelia found themselves standing on a pair of wooden planks above water. Lucy blinked, eyes moving from the window. I didn't know you could make your illusions corporeal. Michello frowned after hearing that, tapping the wood with his stick. It did look real. It's harder and I can't do it for long, Annie replied with a grin, but yay, I can. I've been practicing. Doors jammed, Arthur announced after a moment and moved back in the elbow-high water. He pressed his hands together. Shadow make. He stopped mid-sentence when a shape rose from the water right next to Lucy. Lucy. She turned around, wide-eyed at the purple-skinned humanoid who for all the world looked like he couldn't care less about the three mages now staring at him, all of them ready to use their respective magic. I am here only for the counselor. There is no need for you to die as well, the man said after a moment. You'll have to go through us first, Lucy shot back, hand flying to her keys. The Tartaros member sighed, so be it. What? Michello squeaked, Get him out. Arthur, get them out of here. Lucy and I will hold him back, Annie demanded suddenly of her brother, who looked at her in shock. What? I'm not leaving you here. You're the only one who can get them out of here, she told him, the tone of voice she used eerily similar to Ultear's when she didn't have time to argue. She was younger than him. Shouldn't he be the one telling her what to do? Please Arthur, yes, save me already, that guy will kill me, Michello shouted, still watching the odd man with shark features who seemed content to stand there and watch them argue. Fine, fine, he said, but I'll be back. Arthur sunk into the shadows underwater, and in that second the demon moved. He disappeared under the water so quickly that the two girls barely had time to react before he reappeared right in front of Annie and the former councilman. Annie's eyes widened as she thrusted her hands out. Duplicate! She cried out, seconds before the demon's arms slammed into her and the demon's eyes widened slightly as his hand passed through the girl's chest and she turned to smoke, a dozen copies of her surrounding him. Lucy swallowed her shock, taking out Aquarius key before thinking better of it at the glance of the black water, and she pulled out Taurus key. Gates of the Golden Bull, I open thee, Taurus. The bull spirit popped beside her and looked at her with a grin, shouldering his axe. Get the water out of here. Taurus grinned again, turning towards the wall. Moving it will be a pleasure. Lucy looked back at Annie, her slight form still multiplied as the demon tried to get them out of the way. She was surprised to see the girl was actually decent in hand-to-hand combat. She wasn't anywhere near the skill of the Tartaros member, but the guy still had to concentrate just enough on her that he couldn't ignore her. She glanced at Michello and his granddaughter just in time to see them sink in the shadows with Arthur. One of Annie's copies glanced her way and just in time for the demon to destroy the last of them. What is this water? Lucy finally asked as she stared at it, the level still rising even though Taurus pretty much took down an entire outer wall. It's poisonous, the demon supplied, sounding quite proud of it. And since you have no intention of letting me finish my mission, I will have to kill you. The dignity of my guild would suffer if I failed. Poison. Annie's eyes widened. By now the short girl was fully swimming in it and the demon disappeared under the water. Lucy's eyes widened as well. I can't call Aquarius in this. And I don't have any spirit that could fight in water like this. She glanced at Taurus, who was standing next to her, eyes fixed on the black water below. Annie watched the murky, dark water beneath her in trepidation, not seeing the demon underneath it. Ocean, she finally said, and the water turned a bright blue much to Lucy's surprise. The water was clear, and Lucy could easily see the floor underneath them. It's still poison. It's just an illusion, Annie quickly warned, wide eyes still looking around them. This won't last long, but we can't fight him if we don't see him. We should consider moving outside, Taurus supplied, gesturing to the hole he made, and Lucy nodded, looking back at Annie, who was staring at her wide-eyed. He's not here. Lucy's own eyes widened and the two moved to the exit quicker. He went after Arthur. Arthur coughed, blood flying out of his mouth as the demon's fist slammed into his stomach. Stay back, he warned Michello and Michelia needlessly, since the old man was already running away screaming at the top of his lungs. You should have let me kill him. This does not concern you, the demon said with a frown, moving quickly to drive a knee into Arthur's face. The shadow user managed to push himself away, twisting away, and he gripped empty air, shadows twisting in his grip into a blade. Shadow make. Dagger, he hissed, slashing at the demon, who quickly moved away, the surprisingly sharp blade leaving a thin line on his cheek. Who are you? What do you want? Arthur demanded, breathing heavily. My name is Torafuzar, the demon told him, eyes moving to the retreating form of the counselor. What we want is, beyond your comprehension. Arthur resisted the urge to roll his eyes, hoping he could keep the demon talking. Really? Try me. But Torafuzar had no intention of explaining himself, and the demon rushed towards Arthur, who braced for the attack only for the demon to jump over him and rush towards Michello, who was running over a bridge. Arthur sunk into the shadows again, ignoring how exhausted he already was from crossing such distances in that form, and he shot after the demon. He reached him just in time to push them both off of the bridge, and he ended up submerged in the water of the canal. Arthur's eyes snapped open, the murky water of the canal burning his eyes as he looked at Torafuzar, who was glaring at him. Black liquid once again started spreading through the water, the demon at the center, and Arthur moved to swim for the surface, the air he hadn't taken when he fell underneath now sorely missing. Torafuzar grabbed his leg, appearing underneath him in a second, and Arthur's mouth flew open in shock, water mixed with black entering his mouth and he almost choked. His eyes wide he tried to move into the shadows only for Torafuzar to send him flying through the water with a powerful swing. I realized you have to be still for a moment before you melt into the shadows, the demon spoke as if they weren't underwater. Arthur could already feel the darkness creeping to the edges of his vision and it had nothing to do with the growing blackness of the waters around him. He pushed his hands together, shadows responding to his call as he tried to form an attack. Torafuzar slammed into him before he managed to stop himself and his head slammed into the wall of the canal and he must have lost consciousness for a moment because the next thing he knew, Annie was pulling him out of the water. The younger sibling stared at him wide-eyed in fright and terror and Arthur coughed, water spilling out of his parted lips and he sat up, feeling something warm trickle down his soaked back and neck and his fingers brushed against the back of his head and came back bloody. Where's Torafuzar? He asked, the world spinning around him and Annie looked to the side and Arthur followed her look, his heart stopping at the sight of Lucy hugging the sobbing granddaughter of the former counselor who lied at the other side of the street, pale lips parted in death, black liquid dripping out of them. How long was I out? Arthur sat up, horror filling his eyes. I failed, he thought, broken-hearted. No longer than a minute, Annie said, her voice still worried as she looked at him and he gave her an odd look. We need to get you back to the guild quickly. Lucy will take care of things here. Wah. No, I feel fine. He tried to stand up only to fall back down when the world dangerously tilted. I don't know how you are even alive, Arthur, Annie finally snapped and he looked at her, realizing she was fighting back tears. The black stuff the guy was spreading is poison and you swallowed it. Arthur blinked, shocked. It was not a lot, thankfully, Annie said through gritted teeth and nodded back at the corpse of Michello, the demon, Torafuzar I guess, forced Michello to swallow it and he died in a matter of seconds. The canal is poisoned as well and the black stuff still seems to be spreading through it even though the blasted demon left, he just left. Arthur said, blinking back the black dots in his vision. He probably should hurry back to the guild. Annie looked troubled as well, as far as we could tell, after killing Michello, yes, he just left, how are we going to get to the guild? Arthur asked, finding his surroundings fuzzier and fuzzier. Annie squeezed his hand, her voice trembling. Lucy sent a message to the guild via Lacrima when we found you. Arthur closed his eyes, nodding as he suddenly fell back to the concrete, and Annie's eyes widened. Arthur, am awake, he said, or he thought he did because Annie's frantic calls echoed for some time in his head. A cold hand appeared on his forehead so suddenly it made him flinch. Arthur, that was Natsu. What was he doing here? He suddenly couldn't feel the concrete beneath him and it took him a moment to realize that Natsu lifted him. Annie, stay with Lucy, he heard the man say and the two suddenly seemed to sink, a feeling not unlike going down in an elevator. His stomach flipped and a moment later his back hit the soft mattress. His eyes refused to open and he once again felt a cold hand on his hot, too hot, forehead. It's going to be all right, Natsu's voice again, so quiet Arthur barely heard it. Who was he trying to convince? Acnologia tore off the creature's wings with satisfaction, blood sprouting into his mouth as he clamped his teeth on the joint of the wings. The thing screeched and turned its one eye towards him, ready to use the energy beam before its head was reduced to ash and Igneel spat after it as it fell into the ocean. This is the fourth today, the Fire Dragon King said, staring after the falling corpse before it disappeared underneath the waves. Acnologia nodded grimly. This is getting ridiculous, the Dragon King growled, the two turning back to the island, landing on it moments later. Not one scout I sent found anything. We have no idea where they are coming from, Igneel sighed, looking at Himmel who was talking to two sky dragons before the two flew off. Did they find anything? Acnologia snapped and Himmel's head turned towards them, his pristine white feathers bristling in his agitation. Nothing, my king, he said with a heavy sigh. It truly looks like they just appear out of nowhere. Nothing appears out of nowhere, Kindra suddenly appeared, hissing. She looked at Acnologia, her voice dropping. Could they be from Ozil, High King? Acnologia's expression darkened even further. Considering what my son told me and what happened, it is a real possibility, but as you said, Queen Kindra, nothing appears out of nowhere. We should have been able to find from where they came. Even creatures of Ozil need a gateway and they don't just appear anywhere. Igneel sighed again, looking at the waters below them. We can't just let this continue. If demons are attacking the floating island, that means gods of Underworld declared war on mortal plane. Technically it wasn't them who attacked first, Kindra spoke, annoyed only to be pinned by Acnologia's glare. Be careful what you say, Queen Kindra. They took the soul of a dragon, it was our right to take it back, will other gods see it that way? Kindra shot back and knew in a second, she crossed the line when black sparks of chaos energy flickered around Acnologia, his face thunderous, and in one quick movement he was standing in front of her as he stared her down, his bulk larger and taller than her own. Do not forget who is your king, Kindra. She froze, the omission of her title stung, but she found her voice dying at the spark in Acnologia's eyes. The king changed so drastically after his son's death that it was staggering. In one moment, he appeared to be far more relaxed and easier to approach, on the next a spark of ages-old madness crept up, the madness that almost destroyed the dragons once upon a time. She looked away, unable to meet his glare anymore but still feeling her anger spike, her pride hurt. She glared at his back as he turned around to bark orders at the others. A moment later a grim smirk lifted her lips and she shook her head. Himmel gave her an annoyed look that seemed to say, you had to make his already bad mood worse, and she felt the need to roll her eyes. She and Acnologia will always say exactly what they think of each other. They respected each other too much to do anything less. And here I feared it would be boring with Acnologia-sane, Atlas Flame said, not even bothering to whisper, and a few dragons turned to look at him, most still not used to his sudden reappearance. Acnologia glared at him, a beginning of a growl deep in his throat before he turned and stalked off. You're all acting like children. I can't believe I'm younger than you. Igneel nudged his friend into the shoulder, snickering, you know, sooner or later you'll say something when he's in a bad mood and then I'll have to save your sorry butt, isn't he always in a bad mood? Adalstian said, his attempt to be quiet ruined by his booming voice. Himmel stared at them, his expression scandalized. We shouldn't talk like that about the king. It's against etiquette. The air in the hall was heavy, smelling of an odd mix of ozone and sulfur. Such a strange mix, yet it perfectly described the magic that saturated the air and created it. Everyone sat on the edge, staring at their new guild master who sat on one of the tables, legs on the bench with such a glare fixed on his face that it seemed if he turned that look on anyone, they would drop dead. Natsu truly felt the urge to strangle someone in a way he hadn't felt for years. And considering everything he went through recently, that was saying something. Ultear and Mira have arrived at the former chairman's place, Levi said over the quiet talking of the guild, unnecessarily loudly considering Natsu was pretty much capable of picking out every conversation currently going on in the guild hall. He gave a short nod, clenching his jaw as he suddenly hated accepting the position of the master that apparently required for him to stay inside the guild in a time like this. He needed something to do or he will kill someone in here accidentally. His expression darkened as he glared at the doors of the guild. Jalal was just glad the dragon wasn't looking at him at that moment even as he continued to talk to him. You have no idea what Tartaros would want with the council. Natsu's voice was deceptively calm. Jalal dared a glance at the dragon who was still glaring at the doors of the guild, as if it was their fault they did not know where to look for Tartaros. It's not that I have no idea, it's that I have too many ideas, Jalal muttered, regretting it almost instantly when those red eyes turned to him and he flinched before he could stop himself. If Natsu noticed, he did not acknowledge it. Then start listing. Jalal stayed quiet for a moment, obviously thinking. After a moment his expression turned from thoughtful to horrified and he looked at Natsu. You said they are all demons, right? Natsu nodded, staring at him, and Jalal swallowed. Face. Natsu repeated, wondering if he heard correctly. It's a weapon controlled by the council, Jalal explained, his voice growing more serious and surer as he turned the idea in his head again. It made sense that they were after it. It would destroy all the magic on the continent. The guild fell silent again and Natsu stared at him, anger fading to disbelief for a brief moment before realization dawned on him. A growl escaped his throat. Urza stood beside them in an instant. Why does the council even has something like that? How would it even work? Jalal hesitated before shrugging helplessly, I am unsure. My guess would involve magical barrier particles spread in enough quantity to cover the continent. Urza's eyes widened. That would make all the mages dead or useless and give curse users free reign to do as they pleased, Natsu hissed. What would possess anyone to create something like this? Jalal paused, and Natsu knew immediately he wouldn't like the answer. It was actually made centuries ago, just as the war with the dragons ended. It was made as a last resort should they attack again, Natsu pinched the bridge of his nose, not quite sure how to deal with the amount of stupidity such a plan would require. And in response, they decided to just poison the air. It was a rhetorical question, but Natsu's stomach turned to lead. If Tartaros managed to enable Face to fire, the floating island was above Fury. There was a very real possibility that they would be caught in the blast. Fury almost made him stumble as it returned full force. How would Tartaros know about this? I assume it was a well-kept secret. He barely managed to talk with anger, making every muscle in his body clench painfully, his mind miles above him on the island that held the last of the dragon kind, in the infirmary with his son who still hasn't woken up and Laxus who still might die. Jalal shrugged. It was. Only the highest seats in the council were even privy to the complete info about the face, the rest of us were just told the basics. I don't even know, Natsu. The dragon was standing now, eyes wide. Blood rushed in his ears, deafening, and he looked at Jalal for a brief moment with such an expression of horror that Jalal could do nothing but stare back. Natsu's mouth opened for a brief second and then his teeth clenched, suddenly longer and sharper than they have been, and before Jalal could ask what was wrong, the dragon disappeared through the void. Everyone stared after their master and Jalal went over what he had said, trying to figure out what the hell was happening. It was Urza who supplied him with the answer, her eyes also wide as she stared at him. Mira and Ultear, she breathed out. Jalal looked at her confused for a moment before he looked back where Natsu had stood, realization dawning. You don't think, the former chairman. Shit, Jalal spat, jumping to his feet, curses and profanities leaving his lips. He wasn't even aware he knew. He could be wrong, right? Annie's voice made him look at the girl who hasn't said a word for hours. Her face drawn and pale, still filled with horror from what happened to Arthur, now tinged green at the thought that her mothers might die as well. Jalal stood up, uncertain of what to do. The girl looked ready to faint. He could. Urza nodded, though while she sounded hopeful, she certainly didn't sound convinced. Do you know what Tartaros is after? Ultear asked, hands clasped around the cup of steaming tea. The former chairman scratched his chin, hidden underneath the thick beard. That is a good question, one I asked myself since I saw what happened to my poor colleagues. He sighed heavily, looking into his own tea. Terrible, terrible. Mira took a sip of the golden liquid. There must be something you could tell us. Surely as a former chairman, you can think of something. Crawford frowned, staring at Mira for a good moment before a grin broke his face and Ultear raised an eyebrow. I knew I've seen you before. Mira's eyes widened in horror, face turning an interesting shade of red, and Ultear turned to stare at her. She was a model, Ultear said, not sure if that was what he was referring to, but it was the only thing that might make Mira turn red like that, though it never did before. You interrupted our trial of Mr. Souleater and pretended to be him. Ultear's mouth fell open, turning to Mira, who ducked her head and tried to hide her face in her cup. You what? Mira sighed, looking away with pursed lips. It happened before we met you. Natsu was asked to come to the council for some sort of formality. I did not know that, and she managed to get them both sent into a cell for a night, Crawford finished happily. Ultear blinked at Mira, choking on her tea a moment later. He asked for separate cells if I recall correctly, Crawford continued, and Ultear swallowed, now laughing with her head thrown back. He was a bit miffed, Mira muttered, glaring at Ultear, who gasped for air, still laughing. Could we please talk about why we came here? It's far more important than one of the most embarrassing moments of my life. I'd beg to differ. Ultear grinned at her, but turned serious with a nod. But yes, we are here about Tartaros. You have to tell us something, sir. I know you are sworn to secrecy, but certainly, this is more important. Certainly, Crawford replied with a frown, looking at the cups in front of the girls. How do you like your tea? I made it myself. The two women frowned, sharing a brief look. It is delicious, but please could we stay on topic, Mira said. Crawford nodded, raising his hands apologetically. Of course, I'm sorry. It's just been a while since I talked to anyone. Let's see, what could Tartaros want? There are many weapons and secrets the council guards. For example, with the council crippled as it is, Etherian cannot be fired. Maybe that was their goal. Ultear shook her head. If that was the case, they wouldn't be killing off the former members as well. Mira suddenly stood up, accidentally knocking down her cup and spilling the tea over the wood, but her eyes were not on the cup but on the window. Ultear was standing a moment later, looking outside as well. They are here, the time mage hissed, and Crawford paled. Tartaros, stay inside, sir, Mira instructed, the two women moving outside quickly. 30 men in black and silver armor stood around the house, red eyes from underneath the helm staring at the two mages. Mira cracked her knuckles, magic flaring around her, and Ultear brought her hands up, her orb flying in a circle around her, leaving its past copies behind. Wings spread behind the white-haired mage, her Satan soul clear for all to see. Let's teach them not to mess with fairy tale, Mira growled, and Ultear nodded in agreement. They will pay for what they did. The men rushed at them, 2 steps down the clearing before dozen disappeared in a purple blast. Mira's furious gaze locked on the remains, smoke rising from her outstretched hand. Ultear was moving as well, her own magic turning the undergrowth around them to a jungle of her own making. One soldier came behind her only for her orb to slam into his head, the helmet dented and a sickening crunch was heard and the man fell to the ground. Mira twisted in the air, picking off another 5 as they came towards her, and Ultear trusted her hand in front of her, shouting the final spell that reduced the last soldiers into a paste as the orbs around them suddenly plummeted into them. Mira stood still for a moment, waiting for someone else to appear out of the woods that surrounded them. Her nostrils flared and she looked at Ultear, who looked just as much on the edge as Mira felt. This was too easy, Mira said, her hair falling around her shoulders as she dispelled the takeover. Ultear nodded, staring around the clearing and then glancing back towards the house. She stumbled, the floor underneath her feet suddenly tilting, and she gave a strangled gasp, her vision blurring. Mira moved towards her, the other woman's name dying on her lips as she collapsed into the dirt moments after Ultear. Crawford peeked out of the house, watching the slaughtered demons with a scowl before his eyes fell on the unconscious forms of Ultear and Mira Jane, and yellow teeth spread into a grin underneath the white beard. He walked towards them, picking both women up quickly, chuckling. My, he said to himself, this was almost too easy. The figure fell out of the sky like a meteor, black and red magic crackling around him. Blood-red wings spread behind his back, tail with a blade on the end coiled around him like a serpent. Red eyes framed in black scales looked around the quiet clearing, immediately seeing the dead demons lying in the grass, their blood still wet. Mira, he called, eyes moving across the bodies. Ultear. When no one answered, he shot towards the house like a bullet, lifting off of the grass and flying towards the wooden doors, not even bothering to slow down as he slammed into them, knocking them down and landing on his clawed feet. He growled in frustration when he saw no one and sniffed the air. The stench of herbs in the air made his head swim for a moment. The headache he had since morning, turned into a migraine since he transformed, now slammed into the back of his eyelids like a hammer, making him close his eyes with a wince. He pushed past it, for there was no time to stop because of a simple headache. They have definitely been here recently. He looked at the table, eyes falling on the bag with fairy tales symbol on it and a bulge inside which he knew was the communication lacrima. He grabbed the bag off of the chair with a jerk. He looked at the table, the teacups innocently sitting there, one turned over and he walked closer, picking the fallen cup and taking a deep breath. Mira's lilac lipstick hit his nose, but underneath it chamomile tea, and he snarled at the cup, hurtling the decorated ceramic into the wall. It was spiked. To Anksarum with you, Crawford, Natsu snarled, magic dancing around him, and with a roar, he slammed both hands into the ground, a black and red sphere spreading around him and the house exploded outwards, obliterated. He stayed with his hands on the floor, the taste of copper on his tongue as he growled, "You will not know what hit you, you fat bastard." He shot again into the air, the roof along with most of the walls gone and not hindering his quick exit. He flew as fast as he could, uncaring of the strain he felt, and he knew that Acnologia and Himmel were right. He was not ready for this. Something warm trickled down his chin and he almost hesitantly moved a hand to his chin, not slowing down at all. His fingers came back red and he clenched his teeth in anger. He shouldn't have let them go alone. He should have gone with them as he wanted to, not let them talk him out of it. He let Arthur and Annie go alone and look at what happened. He will make Crawford suffer. He followed the scent like a bloodhound, mile after mile eaten away by his speed. Unheeded, the black poison gathered on his claws and he flexed his fingers automatically. Yes, Crawford better hopes he's dead already by the time Natsu comes knocking on the door. The bag on his shoulder opened and the lacrima almost fell out. The dragon caught it in the last second, glancing down at the blue orb as if he forgot he had it with him. He looked back up, an island, a cube, flying in the middle of the sky, and he knew he found it. The Tartaros headquarters. His lips pulled over his lips into a mockery of a grin. He looked back at the lacrima in his hand and after a moment of hesitation, activated it. Are you sure this is the place? Jalal asked, confused and worried as he looked at the smoking ruin of what had to be the former chairman's home. Of course, I am, Gajil snorted, looking around, arms crossed over his chest. Levi said this is it, Happy acknowledged, looking around. Though I don't see a sign of Mira, Ultear or Natsu. Maybe he took them back to the guild and we missed them, the blue cat supplied. I doubt that, Lily shook his head, white wings spread around him as the small group moved towards the house. I mean he would have contacted us, something happened here, though, Gajil said, moving through the debris, his nose twitching. It smells like Souleater, so he was definitely here, and the girls? Jalal asked, hopeful. Gajil shrugged, the only residue of their scent, not enough to track any of them, so, what? Happy frowned. We just go back to the guild without Mira, Ultear, and Natsu. The small cat paused, an odd expression on his face, Master. The Iron Dragon Slayer gave his wheezing chuckle in response, that still sounds so weird, it will take some time getting used to, Jalal agreed with a small grin. He sighed then, once again looking around. If he doesn't contact us, I guess the best we can do is go back to the guild. As if summoned by his words, the lacrima in Jalal's bag gave a shudder and the mage quickly pulled it, almost dropping it in his haste. Natsu. There was no response from the other line, only the sound of rushing wind and moving scenery, and it took Jalal a moment to realize the dragon was flying. And then he realized what the dragon was showing them. Gajil. The mage yelled, pointing at the cube they could both see in the distance, rapidly growing closer. Shit. Gajil cursed, eyes wide, no wonder we couldn't find them. They are moving the fucking hall with them. The coordinates, Jalal muttered frantically, fiddling with the lacrima before a set of coordinates appeared above it, and just as suddenly as the dragon had called them, he hung up, moments before he landed on the cubic island. We have to get there, Gajil said, Lily already grabbing the back of his shirt with his paws, Happy doing the same for Jalal, who shook his head. We have to tell the guild. By the time we get everyone together, that cube thing will move and we might not be able to get to Natsu, Gajil pointed out, and Jalal frowned before he took of his bag and threw it at Gajil, who easily caught it. You go after him, make sure you are not seen and contact us when you get the chance. I'll go and get the guild ready. The two men exchanged a nod before the cats lifted them into the air, carrying them each in their own directions. Doranbolt shifted uneasily in his seat again, fiddling with the expensive coat he was given to signify his sudden status. Ward sat perfectly calm in his own chair, apparently completely used to being in the same room as one of the most important people in the country. Maybe even the most important person in the country. Toma E. Fiore cleared his throat, interlacing his fingers as he looked at the two men. This is very serious, he finally said after minutes of silence that followed Doranbolt's retelling of the massacre at Era. But, truth to be told, that is not why I called you here. Well, not the only reason. The king waved a hand through the air and a servant presented the three with newspapers. Doranbolt grimaced, knowing exactly what the king wanted to know. He glanced at Ward, who could pass for a wooden statue with how much he moved during the whole conversation. This is about Souleater, Ward spoke, and the king nodded. I will not ask if this is true, Toma said, much to Doranbolt's surprise. The king saw it and smiled to himself. I know only the basics of magic and how it works. That is why there is a magic council. After all, we all owe Souleater a debt for what he did, so I will not question the truth of this statement. There is obviously something that isn't being said, but if I asked if this is true, I would be either forced to do something I do not want, or you would be forced to lie. He smiled again, folding the newspaper and putting it aside. No, I do not want to know where did Souleater disappear to for half a year. I want to know how certain you are that he can be trusted. Before Ward could respond, Doranbolt already opened his mouth. Absolutely, and it wasn't even a lie. Doranbolt's face was serious and the king looked him in the eyes for a moment, the two holding each other's gaze until the king looked at Ward, who simply nodded, glancing at Doranbolt. The king paused, then nodded, another smile on his old face. Good. Doranbolt wondered, since when did the king care about Souleater? He didn't ask and the king didn't elaborate. Toma's face turned serious again and the king sighed, rubbing his forehead for a moment before he spoke. Now, about Tartaros, immediately noting he was no demon. He actually looked familiar. Who are you? Silver, the black-haired mage responded with a sharp grin. It is nice to finally meet you, Mr. Soul Eater, that's him. Franmalth said, staring at the demon. Could it be? Could he be? Silver looked back at his fellow guildmate with a frown. You actually didn't know? That's rather ignorant. Natsu shook his head, both hands suddenly wrapped in chaos energy as he pointed his palms at the two. I am not here to talk. We passed that point when Laxus was poisoned. Silver's eyes widened and he jumped away just as the beam of energy spread out of Natsu's hands, Franmalth doing the same. Franmalth snarled as another part of the hallway exploded. How many souls will that cost? How many? Only your own. Natsu was standing in front of him. He slammed the palm of his hand with all his strength into the demon's head and Franmalth was sent flying, but he didn't have to follow him before he ducked under a blast of ice coming out of Silver's hand, and the Dragon Prince knew immediately why the man was familiar. Who is Grey Fullbuster to you? Any trace of a smug smirk disappeared from Silver's face. Don't say that filthy name. Natsu gave a mockery of a smile to Silver. A son, then. Silver's face darkened even further and he slashed through the air with his hand, the air suddenly beyond freezing, and Natsu twisted out of the way of the first wave, the second catching the fingers of his barely healed hand, and he grimaced. He sent a blast of black and red energy at Silver, forcing him to move and twist his tail, ready to slash the other mage in half with the curved blade on the tip. Kyoka, the demoness looked up from her table, her blue eyes locking on Jackal yellow ones. I see Lami finished with you already, Kyoka said in a way of greeting, standing up from the chair and moving to the sofa. Jackal grinned, though it looked strained, and Kyoka frowned. I've been awake for a few hours now, Jackal said, his voice surprisingly flat. What is it? The demoness said, rolling her eyes. She sat down, crossing her legs and looking at the other demon, who shrugged. I went and looked up some information on the guy who managed to kill me, he said, and Kyoka realized that the demon was holding some papers. She extended her hand and Jackal presented her with one picture. She sat straight in her sofa, eyes wide as she snatched the piece of paper out of Jackal's fingers. You must be mistaken, she said, tearing her eyes away from the picture. I'm afraid I'm not. The guy is known as Fairy Tale's Dragon. Apparently it is quite literal, Jackal said, a scowl on his face. Kyoka blinked in shock, looking down on the picture in her hand. The red eyes on a black reptilian head stared back. If she didn't know any better, she would say she was looking at Acnologia. And wasn't that a frightening thought? I wouldn't be surprised if the two were connected, Jackal said as if reading her thoughts, and she nodded in agreement, once again looking up at her fellow demon. You're not telling me everything, she concluded. There are rumors, Jackal spoke, that he's a demon. Kyoka looked back at the picture. Didn't you say he's a dragon? What is he? Who knows, Jackal shrugged. But I do have some good news. He presented her with a second picture. I'm pretty sure he's a family guy. Kyoka looked at it, a poor quality image of 5 people sitting in a restaurant. But poor quality or not, it was easy to see who it was on the picture, and a grin split her face. She stared at it for a second and Jackal raised an eyebrow expectantly, a grin forming on his own face. So, am I good or am I good? Kyoka started laughing, a chilling sound that only served to make Jackal join her. What a wonderful coincidence, the demoness said, still grinning, once she stopped laughing. These two lovely ladies are our guests, she purred, and Jackal's eyes widened a fraction before he grinned again, a sharp and dangerous edge in his lips. Lami will soon start working on them if she hasn't done so already. Wouldn't it be amazing? These two against their dragon. Do you think he could kill them as easily as he did you? Jackal's grin disappeared, replaced by a scowl. Fuck off, Kyoka. I'd like to see you try and take him down, the green-haired demon tutted, smiling. Don't be so touchy. It was a jest. I'll give you something to laugh at. All right, Jackal muttered. He looked back at the picture, his eyes lighting up excitedly a moment later. I have an idea. Kyoka smiled again, lifting a bottle of wine from the coffee table and pouring it in one of the glasses. Let's hear it. She presented the glass to the blonde demon, who grinned and threw himself onto the sofa, taking the wine with him and downing the entire glass in one gulp. Kyoka scrunched her nose at him, sipping out of her own glass. The room shook suddenly, a sound of explosion making both demons jump to their feet. Kyoka scowled, looking at Jackal. You go and get that idea into motion, she said, already halfway out of the room. I'll go and see what those idiots upstairs are up to. Natsu twisted in the air as a giant pillar of ice suddenly shot through the air to impale him. He could feel the magic in it, the twisted and foul stench it gave off. He knew already he was fighting the same guy who froze Atlas Flame. He could feel the way his skin burned every time he touched the ice that slowly but surely spread around the room every time Silver missed. The mage was powerful, and that wasn't even counting the other demon who was screeching behind him, wearing Hade's face, and wasn't that disturbing? Franmalth's arm suddenly managed to leech around his shoulders. He cursed, deflecting a punch that would surely break his jaw with a clawed hand and lashed out with his tail, making Silver jump back unless he wanted to be opened from throat to navel. He could feel the strength leaving him the longer Franmalth had a hold on him, and while he was fighting off Silver the other hands joined the first and Natsu cursed again. He pulled his wings around him, gathering magic quickly. Get off me. Black sphere spread around him, wall and ceiling exploding around him, and Franmalth was sent flying back with a shocked cry. Silver wrapped himself into an icy cocoon, avoiding being smashed to pasta as a particularly large piece of ceiling fell right on top of him only to slide harmlessly away. But Natsu's hand packed more strength than simple falling debris and he slammed into the cocoon with all his might. Chaos Dragon's iron fist. He got a brief look at Silver's shocked expression when his armored shelter suddenly exploded before he sent him flying back with his knee. Silver crashed into the wall with an OMPF, and Natsu moved to finish him off while he was dazed only for Franmalth to jump at him again, an energy beam of black and red he knew well flying towards him. Eyes wide, he flew up and away from it, staring at Franmalth who was crackling with chaos energy. Cast whatever you want, mage, he spat the noun as if it was something foul, you are only making me stronger. How much stronger are you going to make me, little mage? How much? Natsu stared at him a moment longer before a grin spread over his face. A grin Franmalth did not like. You wrapped yourself into the chaos energy. Instead of responding, Franmalth sent another beam of magic towards him only to watch in shock as it twisted midair and flew straight at Silver who was getting back to his feet. I control the chaos, Natsu responded to the demon's shocked expression, a sinister grin that would make even Lilith Bach spreading over his face. Franmalth scowled and tried again, sure that it couldn't be possible. But it was, apparently, as the beam once again twisted midair around the demon at the mere gesture of his hand. He rose a hand towards Franmalth and the demon suddenly felt as if his own power was crushing him. Frantic, he released his hold on the chaos magic around him and focused on the magic Hades had left him, sending it out in a burst towards the demon. But he wasn't fast enough and Natsu couldn't suppress a tight grin that spread over his teeth hideously and he slammed what was left of the chaos energy that Franmalth used in his own magic into the small demon, effectively knocking him out if not outright killing him. Natsu cursed. The concentration it took to control the chaos around him made him lose concentration in other areas and now he paid for it as he was sent flying back and he would have collided with the wall had Silver not slammed into him. He hissed, several ribs breaking on impact as he was sent sprawling on the floor. What an arrogant fool, he told himself with a scowl, forcing the demon slayer back once again. He twisted in the air again, dodging Silver's attack again. It was now one-on-one and despite how much Franmalth took out of him Natsu was confident he could win. Both Tartaros members had taken far more hits than he did and now one was down. All it would take would be a well-placed spell and he stumbled in his next attack as the world suddenly turned black. He turned around, eyes wide yet unseeing. A sound of air shifting and he jumped away, unsure what was happening. He tried to focus his pupils, wondering if it was the light that suddenly disappeared. But he accomplished nothing and he once again dodged another attack. Interesting, a new voice, a female one joined them and Natsu whirled around, sending a blast of energy in her direction. His ears told him she had jumped away and he fired again, running towards her and at the same time dodging the blast from Silver. The female demon let out a shocked sound, apparently not expecting him to recover so soon from whatever she did to him. He certainly hoped the blindness was not permanent. What the? He can hear you, Kyoka, Silver told her and the demoness gave a sound of understanding just as Natsu moved to slam his tail into her. Just as suddenly as the sight left him so did the sound and he stumbled again. Before he could recover from it a blast of cold covered him, freezing him in spot and he would have growled if he could. It burned. The ice felt like a hot iron against his skin. He couldn't see anything or hear anything. All he had was the scent of the foul ice he was closed into. You have excellent timing, Kyoka, Silver said, eyeing the frozen dragon prince. He would make a frightening statue, indeed. He pressed a hand to his side, bleeding quite heavily. Had Kyoka not arrived when she did, he was quite certain Lami would have her hands full. "That is Souleater?" Kyoka asked, her voice controlled, but it wasn't too hard to hear the surprise in it. "He came here following Crawford," Silver said, gesturing to the man on the ground, still twitching, his face twisted in agony. Kyoka raised an eyebrow, not sure what to think anymore. What did he do to him? Silver shrugged. "It was some sort of poison, I think," Silver supplied, once again looking back at Natsu, his face frozen in a vicious snarl. "I say we kill him as quickly as we can. This guy is too dangerous." Kyoka seemed to consider it a moment too long, apparently, because a crack suddenly spread over the ice and the three demons stared in silent shock as the ice burst apart and the deaf and blind dragon prince threw himself back through the hole in the wall and disappeared over the edge of the cube before any of them managed to so much as blink. "Well," Kyoka started, "I agree with you, Silver, but he's blind and deaf," she continued. "He couldn't have gone far, but he could be out of range of your powers soon enough, Kyoka." "He does have wings," Silver reminded her dryly, and the demoness snorted. "As long as he's here he is within range, and what's stopping him from leaving?" Silver countered. Kyoka smiled in response and turned to leave. "Get our soldiers to find him, and turn on the gravity on all sides," she told Silver, and then, almost as an afterthought, she gestured vaguely to Crawford and Franmoth, "and take them to Lami. Maybe she can figure out what Souleater did to Crawford." Natsu floated in the air on the side of the monstrous island, one hand resting against the rocky surface. His touch and smell were the only things he got left to ground himself. The world was a terrifying place without sound and sight. He had been thought to fight blind. Acnologia insisted on it. "Losing an eye is far easier than you might think," the Dragon King had said. Natsu was inclined to agree, fingers tracing over the scar that ran over his eye. He stopped suddenly, fingers hovering over the eye. What did Kyoka's curse affect, actually? The eye or the nerve or his magic? He clenched his left fist, the only sign that it had been burned beyond recognition, that it had been blown away, a heavily scarred skin. If his arm had grown so quickly, would something smaller grow even faster? His fingers pressed slightly harder against his eyelid. Could he be lucky enough that the curse would affect the actual organ and not him? And would his eye even regenerate as his arm did? He was no stranger to losing them, he concluded with a sort of morbid amusement. Both eyes liquefied and turned to goo when he first transformed into a dragon. And he spent better time of 5 months in hell torturing souls and in turn torturing himself. He had pulled out his own eye almost on a daily routine. Not that he was eager to repeat the experience. He stopped. He had to think rationally, something that he failed to do for days now, much to his embarrassment. Had he managed to keep a cool head, he would have already killed Franmoth and Silver before Kyoka appeared, he was certain of it. The demons of Tartaros were strong, but it took 3 of them to give him a pause. And now that Kyoka's powers lost their surprise, they lost another advantage. He was raging on the inside for what they dared to do, but he couldn't let it affect him like this. He had learned this in Ozel. Emotions are to be used against others, not against himself. The world suddenly tilted and Natsu felt a pull to the side. Too surprised to react, he landed on his side on the ground he had been touching. He blinked, sitting up. Artificial gravity. He turned his head to look around but growled in frustration when he saw nothing, his frustration growing further when he did not hear his own growl. It was beyond deconcentrating. He took a deep breath and, taking advantage of the new gravity, he sat down and crossed his legs. He pulled the magic around himself, locking the emotions behind the walls in his mind as he performed the well-known steps of the deadly dance. He shifted in his seat, his tail coiling around him like a serpent before he tugged the energy around him and in him deeper inside, and with the sound of breaking bones and tearing skin, the wings and horns and the tail disappeared. That taken care of, he once again went back to his previous thoughts. He looked at it objectively. He couldn't sit here until something happened. He couldn't leave for the fear that he wouldn't be able to find them again. And he couldn't stay blind and deaf. The ear was far more complicated than an eye, at least for what he had in mind. Fingers once again traced the eyelid over his scarred eye. Even if it doesn't regenerate, it is damaged, so it wouldn't be too big of a loss. He scowled, determined to get it done before he changed his mind, and he opened his eyes, fingers digging into the socket before he pulled it out with a jerk. Despite being prepared for the pain, he was still fairly certain he had at least gasped. Not that he heard it. He scowled, biting the inside of his cheek hard enough to draw blood, which he promptly spat. The grip on the uneven round lump that was his eye tightened momentarily before he tossed it away, and he brought the blood-coated hand to press the empty socket. He truly hoped this would work, because if he stayed blind, or gods forbid eyeless, he will feel immensely stupid. His breathing was coming out in short bursts as he tried to push away the pain. Why did he think this was a good idea? So much for not doing anything rash. Even with most of his emotions locked away, he was still able to feel frustrated. He gingerly pulled away the blood-coated hand, gingerly blinking only to grimace again. He stopped suddenly, magic and curse gathering in equal measures around the empty socket, and he held his breath, recognizing the feeling that accompanied the restoration of his arm. The pain took his breath away. Not even pulling his own eye out hurt this much. A short scream ripped from his throat without him even realizing it, and a moment later he blinked again. For a moment panic seized him at the muddled images in front of him, only truly seeing the light and the shadows before he remembered that this was very normal for the damaged eye. Apparently, it didn't give him a new eye but the one he had before. He wondered briefly if it was because of how he pulled it out without damaging it too much in the process. His arm certainly returned marked. Natsu sighed as he stood up. Whether his other eye would return to its previous state or be damaged was not something he was willing to test. Which meant that he was stranded on a demon-filled island, deaf and mostly blind. But it was better than it had been before, which meant that he could go back to searching for Mira and Ultear. Jalal got his message, of that he was sure, because he had heard the man's voice even though he hadn't exactly acknowledged it. Should he try and contact them again? He would have thought they would have caught up to him by now. His hand went to the bag on his shoulder and he looked inside at the lacrima only to find it shattered and in pieces. He scowled again. This was turning into a disaster. Well, Tartaros will regret it regardless of his current predicament. He wasn't the only one who underestimated his opponents. They did the same to him, and for that, they will pay. First, he will have to find Mira and Ultear and hopefully get an idea on what exactly the demons planned. He looked around and once again scowled in irritation. He'll get nowhere if he couldn't at least see properly. To ozzle with consequences, he decided and pressed his fingers into the socket of the other eye. When the eye reformed, he couldn't help but hesitate before he blinked them open again. His lips tilted upwards, a dangerous edge to the smile, and he moved with purpose, disappearing into a void. He reappeared inside the ruined hallway his fight with Silver and Franmalf left. It was empty now. He will need to do this carefully. He needed information, and it will be easier to get it if he didn't have to fight his way through the entire guild. Not to mention less time consuming. He'll need to find Mira and Ultear as soon as possible. His grasp on illusion magic was not by any means great, but he was more than capable of casting something as simple as making people not notice him. Once the spell was cast, he looked around again. As much as he would like to transform into a dragon and destroy the whole island, he couldn't, because Mira and Ultear would be in danger of the place crashing on their heads, or the demons could kill them before he reached wherever they are. Deciding on his actions, he started moving through the halls, keeping his illusion in place. Two guards rounded the corner and almost collided with him before Natsu pressed himself against the wall and they managed to not touch him. He watched their backs with a snarl when a thought struck him and he moved towards them. He grabbed the first guard by his head and broke his neck before he could do more than gasp, and by the time the second guard turned, the first was already dead on the floor. The second guard got a brief look at the red, hateful eyes as the illusion faltered before Natsu drew his fist through his chest and pulled out his heart. He looked at the two dead demons coldly, wishing it was this easy to punch through the ribcage of every demon here. But he'll take what he can get in. Reinforcing the illusion, he moved again. His red eyes flashed dangerously and a sinister smile lifted his lips. It was disturbingly easy to fall back to the dark thoughts of his younger self, especially after his death. But he couldn't bring himself to care, because Tartaros deserved every ounce of his bloodthirst. He will enjoy tearing apart each and every demon he comes across. How the fuck is he doing this? Kyoka snarled. The foot soldier that had delivered the news shook like a leaf at her tone, and Kyoka's expression turned darker as she grabbed the man's head and slammed it into the wall, shattering his head across the wall. Silver looked at her unimpressed, hands crossed over his chest as he leaned against the table. Lami shrugged, putting away the needle and the thread she used to patch up the ice mage. We should have killed him when we had the chance, Silver told her, and Kyoka glared at him. The raven-haired man didn't flinch, still looking at her through half-open eyes. It's your fault he escaped, she declared, and before Silver could object, she continued, How can a blind and a deaf human kill 30 demons without anyone noticing him? Exclamation mark. He's leaving behind a trail of corpses miles long. He's looking for something, obviously, Lami commented, but she only half listened to the two, her concentration on the terminal in front of her. Kyoka's look turned from anger to a satisfied grin that made Silver's skin crawl. Oh, I know exactly what he's looking for, really. Lami looked up, smiling sweetly before her eyes narrowed dangerously, and she hissed, then let's lure him out already. He's looking for someone called Mira and Ultear, Silver noted, glancing at the tubes around them, specifically at the two on the far end. I take it this is them. Kyoka nodded, her mood obviously improved. And I bet he doesn't even know that they are not the only ones we brought here, right? Sela brought some brat as well, no? Lami asked, her face once again peaceful. It's a shame you didn't bring her here too. Silver looked at her with a raised eyebrow. Don't you have your hands full? Well, true, Lami acknowledged, her face once again darkening a moment later, but I'd love nothing more than to mess up some more fairies. I don't know why I even bother with this guy. Kyoka glanced at Crawford. The man looked dead, truth to be told, but the monitors indicated that he was still alive. Not for long probably, if the readings were any indication. Whatever Soul Eater did to him was apparently very painful. But they didn't know what it was, which was exactly why he was here, and Lami knew that. So, the green-haired demoness didn't bother to respond, simply looking back at the two female mages that floated in the bluish liquid unconscious. Make sure to not change their appearance too much. I want Soul Eater to know it's them. Lami's mouth fell open before her cheeks turned red in indignation. I had plans for them. They don't deserve those faces. You know I hate doing work on female humans. As if that Minerva chick wasn't enough. Kyoka eyed the other demon with a glare, but Lami only continued to fume. You can't tell me what to do, Kyoka. That's the deal. I do what I want with them. You will do as I say, the demoness said in response, voice cold, and Lami scowled but in the end spoke through gritted teeth. Fine. Silver stayed silent through the exchange, his eyes still fixed on the two fairy tale mages before he pushed himself away from the table and grabbed the top of his armor in order to put it back on. I'll go and check on our guest in the dungeons, Kyoka nodded, not even looking at him as she stared at Lami, who glared back but went back to her terminal. I want you to start working on them now. What about Crawford? We can find out what poison that brat used after he's dead just as easily, Kyoka said with a shrug. Lami sighed in annoyance. Fine. Hours of work, wasted. With who should I start? Kyoka looked at the two fairy tale mages and walked towards them. She stopped in front of them, hands on her hips before she shrugged. Start with the dark-haired one. Lami cracked her fingers. Will do. Kyoka left the laboratory as Lami started laughing. Let's see what we can do to you, bitch. Silence. Acnologia's voice thundered in the full council room, and every king and queen fell silent at once. They have been talking for hours and no one apparently had anything actually useful to say. How he missed his crazy days when he could just kill whoever annoyed him the most without feeling particularly guilty. Not that he would feel far too guilty now, but he did find himself caring what certain others thought. Horrible. Sanity was quite high on his list of things he hated. We are getting widely off the topic. I don't care how many creatures General Pachua killed. He glared meaningfully at Kindra, who pursed her lips. I don't care how much forest got burned by Brantley. He looked at Emerald, who managed to look both insulted and embarrassed. What I care about is where are they coming from and what do they want? He paused, glaring at the gathered dragons. Well, we were fairly certain they were moving underwater to reach the island undetected. Himmel spoke when no one else moved. But we are not above the ocean any longer, which makes that theory null and void. Acnologia blinked, staring at the white dragon with a look that was bordering on startled. Something no one around the table could say they witnessed before. What did you say? Himmel frowned, a bit perturbed by the rather rude gesture. Did the High King even listen to what he was saying? We are not above the ocean. Surely you know this, my king. Acnologia's eyes narrowed into annoyance and the Dragon King's nostrils flared. Yes, I know that. But King Himmel, the void. Igneel seemed to catch the meaning behind it faster than Himmel, his own eyes widening. You're not saying what I think you're saying. But that makes no sense. Only you and Prince Natsu can move through the void, but you can move through the fire. Almost every form of a dragon has some sort of transportation to carry them over great distances, Kindra noted, her own eyes wide, but she frowned soon after, eyes moving to look at Acnologia, whose eyes were trained on her as well. seemingly waiting to see if she caught on to what he realized. But the void is the best way to do it, safest and cleanest. Not to mention untraceable, unlike what Igneel or I could do, and it can get you further than anything else, Acnologia finished grimly. But what could be doing this? Havoc is dead, and I'm certain it isn't me or Natsu transporting those beasts here. The Supreme are not responsible either. Had any of them crossed to the mortal world, we would have felt it. Who else could it be then? Adalstian countered, but he realized the answer before he even finished asking the question. You're not saying that Zirf showed his face again? He is the only one that could be doing this. He is a Chaos Devil Slayer after all, Acnologia spoke, watching as the faces around him darkened further. But if he is making a move like this, Emerald whispered, glancing at the Black King hesitantly, King Acnologia, you know him the best. Acnologia's expression darkened further at the reminder. What is he planning? Acnologia voiced her question. Zirf has been hiding in Lurioa for centuries now, creating demons and who knows what, all in the name of Anksarum. If I had to guess, Zirf is going to attack this plane and seize control over it with the demons, for Anksarum. Himmel said after a moment of silence. Acnologia felt like shrugging. If that motion wasn't so inappropriate for this type of setting, I do not know. That is a safe conclusion, but who knows? That mage only sunk deeper into madness over the decades. The silence fell over the room. Demur broke it, clearing his throat in an uncharacteristic display of uneasiness. Everyone probably shared the sentiment. So, what do we do? We still need to find the source of those blasted flying beasts. If we find the source, we will find who is causing it, if it is Zirf of Anksarum or someone else entirely. Natsu is keeping his eyes on the ground. When something big happens, he will call us. And whatever happens, it will happen soon, and it will happen here in Ishgar. The dragon royalty nodded, eyes and will steeled. It had been a different age when the dragons had gone to war. Humans and demons alike forgot what it meant, but they will be reminded. Igneel broke the silence this time, the fire dragon's voice oddly quiet. What if it's End that's doing this? Acnologia stilled, as did every dragon in the room that had lived through the last war. His book was never found. It is not even certain that he exists, and if he does exist. You know the stories as well as every dragon here that has been there when we fought Zirf and his army the last time. Zirf said it himself, his perfect creation, a demon more powerful than himself. Acnologia's eyes narrowed, and a demon created to finally kill him. I know how you feel about this, King Igneel, but you have to admit that it is unlikely. Unlikely, Igneel agreed, his own eyes narrowed, but possible. It's not End. Acnologia's voice left no room for an argument, his wings spreading slightly behind him in his anger. He sounded almost defensive. You know something we don't, King Acnologia? Kindra asked, her scaly eyebrow raised. Acnologia looked at her, obviously relaxing his stance with great difficulty. I know who End is, he declared, and at once the council was in an uproar. And you tell us that only now? Igneel boomed, eyes ablaze, fire dancing over his claws. Who is it? You can rest assured that he is not a threat, he. Igneel echoed, eyes still furious, and Acnologia held his gaze, knowing exactly in which moment Igneel realized the truth. It was hard not to. There were not many options to choose from after all. Acnologia would hardly be this protective if it was anyone else. Fury disappeared out of Igneel's eyes, and the dragon jerked as if Acnologia slammed into him. How? Acnologia looked around the room, finding different levels of understanding. Most of the dragons seemed confused still. But Himmel apparently realized as well, because the sky dragon looked like he was torn between being sick and fainting. Acnologia's blue eyes turned to steel as he looked at the dragons gathered around him. This meeting is over. Dismissed. His statement was met with an expected uproar. But he didn't care. It was a private affair as far as he was concerned, and as such, he had no obligation to share it with the council. He made his way out of the council, ignoring the kings and queens demanding answers. Igneel caught up to him moments before he left the palace, and the two wordlessly took flight. Acnologia glanced back, making sure no one else was following them. His eyes locked with Himmel's, and he sighed, leading the two to a secluded part of the island. No one spoke as they landed, and Acnologia didn't feel inclined to start. Igneel did. How long do you know this? A little over 2 decades, I think. Acnologia spoke, his voice carefully flat. Himmel didn't say anything, simply staring into the two. So, you knew who it was while I was still searching for the demon? Igneel demanded, and Acnologia shrugged, not bothering with proper manners when the other dragon obviously didn't care either. I think you are getting the wrong idea here, Igneel, the Dragon King spoke. Natsu is not end. Himmel took in a sharp breath, hearing the name making it more real, yet the statement confused him further. What do you mean it's not Natsu? Is this your idea of a joke? Exclamation mark. You all but said it's him not a moment ago. Igneel demanded. That kid's like a nephew to me. You can't keep this from me like that. And why not? Acnologia shot back, his gaze darkening as his mind went back to those dark years. Natsu was my property, he spat, obviously referring to his state of mind at the time. I barely had the boy for a year when Zirf appeared and told me who he could be. I remember the war, Igneel. I knew what the council would do and I was unwilling to give away a human as strong as I had been before I became a dragon. The fact that he wasn't fully human did not exactly bother me too much, and that he was Zerif's made it even better because I could use the kid against him. Could be. And what do you mean Zirf told you? I was not aware you two were still in contact. Igneel spat and Acnologia glared at him in affront. We are not. I do not know how Zirf knew that Natsu was with me, but he was using a thought projection to gloat. He knew I would not turn the boy away or kill him. He will be even stronger now, Acnologia. Thank you. His exact words. End is something Natsu could become if his book was ever found. Until that happens, he is and will remain Natsu Dragneel. Himmel took a sharp breath in, and both him and Igneel looked wide-eyed at the Dragon King. Are you saying, you can't be serious? Himmel finally spoke. Acnologia nodded darkly. But I am. Zirf, Dragneel and Natsu are brothers. The three fell silent. This time it was Himmel who broke it. Does Natsu know? I never told him, Acnologia said grimly. But I have a feeling that Anksaram might have. Igneel shook his head in disbelief. I can't believe you two. What else did you never tell us about? Are we going to find out Havoc is alive as well? After what happened to Atlas Flame I wouldn't be surprised. Acnologia flinched at that and Igneel almost regretted saying anything. Almost. Havoc is dead, Acnologia said, closing his eyes momentarily. He looked at the two, eyes surprisingly honest. I never told you what happened then, have I? I know you won on a fluke, Igneel put in bluntly, and Acnologia's nostrils flared for a moment before he nodded. Despite the circumstances, his pride still hurt. More or less, he allowed. I turned sides in the war after Irene was killed, as you well know. I joined the Fallen. I lost my mind. Those first few decades were filled with madness. He gave a mirthless chuckle. You all know Havoc came alone to fight me almost a year after I left. It was the first time we even saw each other since I left. Despite everything that I did, the old bastard still could kill me. I had no such restriction. You know that story about how I sunk a continent? Don't give me that look, I'm telling the truth. It wasn't a continent though, but an island, and I didn't do it alone. Havoc and I did it in our fight. The fight that lasted for hours. And then, in one moment, Havoc just stopped. He tried talking, the idiot. Tried to come close, to make me see reason. And when he was close enough that he couldn't dodge, I tore his neck open with my bare teeth. Now, centuries after it happened, centuries after he hasn't even truly thought about it, it hurt. He once again cursed the moment Natsu died, for it caused a switch in him to flip, and the last remnants of the madness in him disappeared and left him with this disgusting guilt. What happened in that fight with Havoc was not something he will ever say out loud. Not the whole truth. Not to anyone. You are a son I never had. I already lost my brother. Don't make me lose you too. See reason, Acnologia, it's your own fault Belsarion died, you stupid old dragon. You think I care about you? That I ever cared? You did. You have just forgotten. You're delusional, master. Please, Acnologia. Stop this madness, stop. It's beautiful. Why should I stop? Exclamation mark. Do you know how freeing it is? Irene's death was a blessing in disguise. I am finally free, Havoc. You are breaking my heart. Exactly my point. Get rid of it. There is nothing left in me to break, because everything is already broken. Do you ever stop lecturing? I will stop when you learn. Shut up. Acnologia swallowed, almost tasting the blood in his mouth. Himmel and Igneel were nowhere in sight, and he stood alone. She was sitting on the railing of the second floor in the Guildhall, hidden in the shadows. Only a few candles were still burning, and the guild was empty for some time now. She should go to bed. She could feel how tired she was, and her head dipped down every few moments. A corner of her lips lifted. Now, wouldn't that be embarrassing? Ultear Milkovich, the former leader of the Seven Kin of Purgatory, falling down from the second floor and breaking her neck because she fell asleep. She sobered quickly, looking down at her hands. 6 months have already passed since Tenro sunk. Most of the guild stopped glaring at her. Not that she cared, but she was getting rather tired of it. What was she doing here at this hour? She could not remember now that she thought about it. "Are you all right?" The voice was hesitant, almost as if not used to asking such questions, but even quiet as it was, it startled her enough that she turned around too quickly and almost fell down. She gave a surprised yelp, hand shooting out on instinct, and a cold, strong hand grabbed her own, pulling her up without a problem. She landed on her feet without truly regaining her balance, and she stumbled, falling onto the chest of the one who startled her. Black fabric met her eyes and she straightened, eyes wide as she looked up at the red eyes that stared down on her with an expression that she couldn't place. "Natsu," she finally spoke when the dragon didn't say anything. A corner of his lips lifted for a moment, amusement at her unease flickering in his eyes before he hid it away. "Ultear," he returned before he gestured to the railing and added dryly, "we do have chairs." A small smile lifted Ultear's lips as well. Of all the people in the guild, Natsu seemed to have the least problem with her, surprisingly enough. Really, the guy was the only one who willingly talked to her. He was not much of a talker, as Ultear soon learned, but his company was pleasant. She blushed suddenly when she realized how close she was standing. "Are you all right?" he asked again, this time his tone showing the barest traces of curiosity, and Ultear's face turned a darker hue of red, much to her mortification. Natsu stared at her for a moment, and she could see the moment he realized what the problem was, because there was a mischievous glint in his eyes for a brief moment that looked completely out of place on his usually impassive face. He leaned forward, one hand sneaking to her waist, and she froze, her breath catching in her throat. His lips were surprisingly warm, and she could feel the way he angled his face to the side a moment later, gently opening his mouth and beckoning her to do the same. He was a good kisser, and a good part of Ultear's brain shut down as she leaned closer into his hand, her hips pressing against his. Her eyes flew open suddenly and she pushed him back with a snarl. "What are you doing?" Natsu stared at her, his face carefully blank. She had admired that control before. Now she hated it. "Don't just look at me like that. What do you think I am? I know you and Mira are together. I'm not going to be someone's sideshow." Natsu opened his mouth to say something, but apparently thought better of it because he closed them again and stared at her for a moment longer. The shadows in the darkened guildhall seemed to grow. "You are not a sideshow," he finally said, infuriatingly calm, "and you never would be." Natsu took a step back and into the shadows, disappearing. A sense of loss almost drowned her as it crushed into her, making her gasp for air only for her mouth to fill with sickly sweet liquid. "Natsu." She called the name desperately as the darkness around her grew and the guild disappeared around her and the floor opened beneath her. This is a dream, a memory, Ultear realized even as she kept falling into the abyss. Still, she couldn't shake that feeling of loss and despair. "Natsu." She was terrified. Where was the light? "Natsu, help me. Mira, Arthur, Annie, anyone." She stopped falling, suddenly floating in midair but still in the dark. Still drowning in it. Arthur paused, obviously surprised by the question. "I'm honestly surprised this hasn't come up sooner," he admitted. "Annie and I met Natsu, I think the same year you went to Tenro. But it wasn't actually Natsu that took us in after our house burned down. We went to the guild and it was Mira who started the whole thing. She took us to her house and well, by then Natsu was already more or less living with her and he and Ultear were doing this weird dance around one another. It was beyond awkward, truth to be told, and I don't know what Mira was thinking at the time, but in the end, it all worked out. I'm happy, happier than I ever thought I could be." Wendy smiled, a nostalgic look crossing her face. "I met Natsu when he joined Fairy Tail, only days after I came here myself. Acnologia never taught him how to actually talk to humans and I was the closest thing to a dragon he had." She laughed to herself at the memory. "I was terrified of him." Arthur chuckled and pushed himself off of the wall. "Well then, let's go find Annie." The two rounded the corner only to almost collide with wide-eyed Kana, Carla, and Happy behind her, each with a deck of cards in their hands. "Arthur, can you drag us all into the shadows along with the people in the infirmary like you did during the dragon fight?" Arthur didn't ask why, immediately aware that something was very wrong. Instead, he concentrated on the question and gave a decisive nod to the brown-haired mage even as he proceeded to do as he was told. Not a moment too soon, either, because the moment they were clear, the guild exploded. They exited out of the shadows at the entrance of the grounds, now cowered in the debris. Broken sign with "Fairy Tale" written on it stared back at them, mocking them. Arthur stared wide-eyed, disbelief and horror in his emerald green gaze. Kanna was already on her feet, a scream of frustration leaving her lips, and Carla and Happy stood beside her, dazed in their shock. The guild, everyone. Wendy jumped to her feet, moving towards the ruins, but Kanna stopped her with a firm hand on her shoulder. Everyone in the guild is safe, she gestured to the cards Happy and Carla were holding, and Wendy sank to her knees in relief. Arthur swallowed, palling even further, and Kanna looked at him in pity, not realizing the true extent of his horror until he finally started screaming and she remembered the girl that had gone outside to the grounds. Kanna's own eyes widened before she screwed them shut in grief and anger, fist clenching at her side. Arthur sank to his knees, head buried into his hands, a tortured scream tearing again from his throat. Arc of time. Forward. Mira swallowed what she wanted to say and was forced to move as the two golden orbs suddenly multiplied and surrounded her, seconds before they rushed at her. She dared a glance at the two other demons who watched the two. Lami was laughing joyfully, pointing a finger at the two while Sela only watched in silence. "What did you do to her?" Sela's curse, Ultear was telling her even as she twisted in the air and sent another attack at Mira, who jumped back but didn't respond in kind, refusing to attack the other. Macro. All you have to do is hear her voice and you are no longer in control of herself. Fight it, Ultear, Mira begged her, her vision blurry. "This can't be happening." "I can't," Ultear told her sorrowfully. "I tried but I can't." Mira gave a wordless shout, turning away from Ultear and sending a ball of energy towards Sela and Lami. The sudden change in her focus was enough to surprise the two, and even though Sela easily jumped away, Lami was sent flying. "Release her." "I will not," Sela responded simply, jumping away as Mira slashed at her with her claws. The she-devil twisted on the heel, raising her leg and moving to catch Sela in the side while she was still in the process of dodging, but the demon simply caught her leg with one hand, grasping quickly with the other, and with a twist Mira lost the ground under her feet. A golden orb appeared at her side, twisting in shape in a second and turning sharp. Mira gasped as it dug into her side before ripping itself out faster than she could respond. She landed on her feet, stumbling in the process. "What do you even want from us?" "We want for you to perish," Sela said, hand moving in an arc above her, and books appeared where her hand passed. A symbol on the book caught Mira Jane's eyes and she couldn't help but gasp. She had seen that symbol. "It was you." Sela raised a delicate eyebrow, not even pausing in her attack as she sent the books flying towards her. Mira cursed, ducking under the barrage only to be forced to roll to the side when the ground suddenly crumbled beneath her. "You sent me that letter. You told me it was possible to get Natsu back." Sela blinked, obviously surprised, and her attack momentarily stopped. It was enough of a pause for Mira to change her form. "Take over." Sea-Tree, she twisted out of the way of Ultear's next spell, aware it was coming only thanks to Ultear's own scream. Ultear's spell maybe missed her, but Selis didn't, and she was sent flying as another book slammed into her. "Now why would we care about some human?" Sela hissed. Mira growled at her. "How should I know? It was marked by your guild symbol and signed Z. D." Sela stopped, eyes wide as she turned to Ultear. "Oracle, is that true?" "My name is not Oracle," Ultear spoke through gritted teeth. Sela was not impressed. "Is it true?" "It is. Who would dare impersonate him?" Sela spat, glaring at Mira Jane. "And why are you immune to my macro?" Mira shrugged, taking advantage of the lull in the fight to catch her breath. "And I can't use my takeover on you." "Of course you can't," Sela snapped, managing to look almost affronted. "We are the Aetherius. Something as simple as takeover will not work on us, Aetherius. The strongest demons Zirf created, 9 gates of hell in our master end." Myra's lips twitched into an ugly smile. 9 gates of hell, she whispered, once again wrapping herself in magic. "How would you feel facing down the gatekeeper of hell then, Aetherius?" Ultear's eyes widened behind Sela and the demon tensed without even meaning to. "Take over." Gatekeeper, her feet turned to hooves, her hair transforming into lion's mane that covered her upper body, and behind her a lion's tail snapped like a whip, sparks of blue fire dancing from its edge. Ultear blinked at the gray-skinned Mira Jane, wondering when did this happen. Mira raised her hand towards Sela. Blue Inferno, a ball appeared in front of her palm and a second later transformed into a beam of blue fire. "Burn you bitch," she growled. The attack connected and a startled shout ripped from Sela as she was sent flying back. Mira didn't have time to respond because she once again had to focus on Ultear, who suddenly appeared behind her. Hand-to-hand combat with a four-handed person as skilled as Ultear proved impossible, made only that much harder because of the two golden orbs still fully intent on bashing in her skull. She cursed, jumping back just in time to be hit by Sela's book. "You will not mock us, human," Sela growled at her, magic suddenly wrapping around her. "You already shamed me in front of the lady when your guildmates managed to escape. I will not let you humiliate me further. I order you." "It won't work," Mira told her. "Who escaped? Who else is here? Remove my limit." Mira's eyes widened. She can order herself. "Mira." Ultear's voice made her jump. "Run." She looked at her, just in time to see a fist flying into her face. She deflected it, pushing the hand aside and driving her elbow into Ultear's stomach on instinct. "I'm not leaving you." Sela was already there, however, disrupting the two as she grabbed Mira Jane's face and whirled around, lifting the mage off of her feet. "Demon Eye, open." A blast sent Mira flying back, tearing at her skin, and she screamed, and Ultear moved her hands to attack, screaming as well. In pain, in frustration, in a helpless fury. Arc of time, luminous minutes. The orbs multiplied again, shooting a moment later at Mira in a shower of light. The she-devil gritted her teeth, blue fire dancing around her. Blue eruption. Blue fire exploded around her, shattering the golden objects, and even before the fire died down, Mira jumped at Sela, eyes wide with fury. The black-skinned demon moved back to dodge the moment Mira landed in front of her, but the mage's hand shot out and she grabbed onto the other demon, claws digging into her arm as she managed to wrestle the demon onto the ground for a moment, all her focus on one single thought. Sela's yellow eyes glared at her as she twisted in the vice-like grip and managed to plant both her palms into Mira's stomach. Something twisted in the Aetherius and her eyes widened briefly before she gave an enraged scream. "Demon Eye, release." Mira didn't respond in time and the attack connected, lifting her clean off of the ground. She slammed first into the ceiling, only to be sent flying once again when Sela's enraged form appeared in front of her through the blast and her leg connected with her chest. She slammed into the wall, crumbling to the ground and gasping for air that refused to enter her lungs. Ultear advanced towards her. "Don't make me do this." Ultear screamed even as she moved towards Mira Jane, tears rolling freely down her mismatched cheeks. "A demon is writing this story," Sela told her, her tone cold. "There is no happy ending in it for you humans." Ultear raised both pair of hands, golden orbs suddenly transforming into a spear as she stood above Mira, who was still gasping for breath, her takeover melting away as she lost the concentration. She looked up at Ultear through pain-filled eyes. A small, sad smile lifted her lips. "It's going to be all right." Oracle moved her hands down, tears blinding her purple eyes as she screamed at the demon, "Curse you." Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed, make sure you leave a like. The next part will be out soon.